Hello Year 10 and welcome to this lesson on economic opportunities in London, where we are doing our second lesson looking at London Docklands. So last lesson was all about London Docklands in the past, when it was the centre of the British Empire, and how all the goods were coming in from all across the empire, and there was a thriving industry around Docklands that was all linked to those ships coming in. So lots of factories, lots of manufacturing. And we then looked at the decline of London Docklands throughout the 1960s and 70s until by 1981, when the Docklands completely closed down, just leaving this massive, derelict, empty area right in the centre of London. Now, this was left empty for quite some time until the government decided to step in and start a regeneration programme, which was known as the London Docklands Development Corporation. And this was funded by the government, and they bought up loads of the land and the warehouses, and they started to regenerate the area and make it into a financial centre. They built Canary Wharf, that really tall, distinctive building with the triangle on the top. And for a long time, before it was overtaken by the Shard, that was the tallest building in London. Now, the redevelopment of Docklands is seen in some ways as having been incredibly successful, but there are also problems with it. So eventually the London Docklands Development Corporation was wrapped up and ended by the government, because the area was seen as being so successful that it was able to regenerate its own private investment, and companies and banks and finance houses wanted to be in the Docklands area because it became a huge world financial centre. So we're going to have a look at this lesson at what Docklands is like today, who it's been successful for, and how that's created opportunities. But we're also going to have a little bit of a think about who it's not been successful for and who has been left out of the regeneration. Just to remind you where we are talking about, this map shows you the London Docklands area. So it spreads to the north and the south of the River Thames, around the areas of Tower Hamlets, Southwark, Lewisham, Greenwich and Newham. So these are areas of London that traditionally were very, very working class. It was like sort of one of the industrial hearts of London, lots of factories, lots of manufacturing, and that gradually began to close down. Now let's have a look at some images of Docklands and what Docklands is like today. So as you can see, it's a very far cry from those images from last lesson, where we were looking at active docks with lots and lots of ships, or we were just looking at open, derelict land. So this building here, this is Canary Wharf, very, very distinctive. And you can see as well the HSBC building here and the Citibank building. We can see in the foreground here the River Thames. We do have a boat here, but this is a leisure boat. So you get boats that are basically floating bars or floating nightclubs that cruise up and down the River Thames. Here we have got a view that's more sort of inside Docklands, and we can see that the docking areas have all been cleaned up. We have got the old warehouses being converted into apartments, and these apartments are pretty expensive. We have got these nice sort of glass walkthroughs. We have got a picture here showing the Museum of the London Docklands, and this has been redeveloped from an old warehouse area. And then we can see here that all along the Docklands we've got lots of bars and restaurants have opened up, lots of which have balconies with river views where you get a nice view of the Docklands area. So very, very different. And hopefully as well you've watched that little video from YouTube, which again shows you some of the different ways that Docklands has changed. If you haven't watched that video, do make sure you do, and take a few notes while you're watching it, as you are going to be answering some questions all about it in your assignment. So let's have a look at how employment has changed in London. So this little graph just shows us from 1992 to 2016. The dotted line here is a projection. Okay, I know it's now 2020, so 2016 for us was in the past, but the graph is just a little bit old. And so we can see here we have got an increase in the amount of jobs available in London generally. We've got a couple of areas where we've got a small decrease, most notably just here. So this is after the financial crash in 2008, where a lot of the sort of banking and mortgages began to collapse, okay? But apart from that, we've generally got a pretty steady rise. We've got also a small dip here. We've got a large rise here in the late 90s to the early 2000s, where we had a massive boom. So if we were describing this in an exam, we would simply be saying that generally we have an upward trend, but we would certainly point out this faster increase here, the slow decrease here, and a slightly more pronounced decrease here in sort of 2008 to 2011. Okay, if we have a look in a bit more detail at the type of jobs available, this graph is showing us how those types of jobs have changed. So we can see the key, the orange is 1996, the green is 2013, and we have got lots and lots of different categories of jobs, a tiny amount of primary. So primary is when you are working with the land, and that hasn't changed. Then if we look at manufacturing, okay, so working in a factory has seen a huge decrease, and that just shows you the changes that have happened in London as these factories and the manufacturing have closed down and people have moved out of that area. And then we can see that most of the others have got an increase. Okay, we've got a small decrease here in wholesale as well, but generally speaking we have got increases in most of them. So we can see construction, so the building new buildings has gone up. We have got a massive increase here in professional, scientific, technical and real estate. That has probably got the biggest increase of all. Finance and insurance, that's got a little increase, okay, maybe not quite as big as you would expect, but then this is 1996, so this is after the development of Canary Wharf and London Docklands had already started. But we can see that all these increases are based in a type of work that we would call tertiary or quaternary, or services. So that's when you're not making something physical and concrete that you can touch, but you're providing a service for somebody. So maybe banking, hairdressing, working in a shop, education, okay? For a lot of these jobs, you need a decent level of education, okay? You can't leave school with barely any GCSEs and walk into a really good job at a bank that pays you loads of money. And on that video on YouTube, it was telling you that in Canary Wharf, you had got salaries in excess of 100 grand. And that's just the average salary. There's going to be people working there that are earning far, far more than that. And that takes us sort of to one of the criticisms of the redevelopment of Docklands, okay? So this picture here shows you dock workers in London in 1979. But just 2 years after this photo was taken, these men would have been left with no work at all. So what you need to ask yourself, well, why didn't the redevelopment work for them? And if it didn't work for them, who did it work for? And why this is a problem? Okay, so these two fellas who've spent their lives working in London Docklands, it's not as if you can spend 20 years working in the docks and then when all the docks close down and it's redeveloped into a financial, retail and services sector, you're not going to be able to get a job. You're not going to be a docker one day and then go and get a job and work in a wine bar the next day. So that is one of the big criticisms of London Docklands. Yes, it's provided an incredible amount of investment and wealth. It is an incredibly successful financial centre, and it's no doubt been a part of making London, up with New York, one of the most important financial centres in the whole world. However, it didn't help the London Docklands people that were left with no jobs in the first place when the Docklands closed down. Yes, there are unskilled jobs there. You can get a work in a bar or in a shop, but they don't really suit the skills of the dockers that were there. Maybe you could get work as a security guard or a cleaner, something like that in the offices. But even so, there weren't enough of those sorts of jobs available. So as is often the case with these redevelopment opportunities, yes, they do provide work and they do provide opportunities, but it's often for very well educated people who already come from a financial services background. So all these jobs that were created, they weren't necessarily being taken by people who lived in the London area already. People were moving to London in order to take advantage of those highly skilled, highly paid jobs. House prices massively went up in the Docklands area, rents massively went up, and these unemployed dock workers simply couldn't afford to be there any longer. So just as like when we looked at the Makoko case study in Lagos, the redevelopment of London Docklands wasn't necessarily solving the problems of poverty and unemployment. It was just moving them elsewhere. Okay, so try and bear all that in mind when you're answering the questions on your assignment. Make sure you have watched the video on YouTube as well as this one, and if you have any questions then please do email your geography teacher and they will help you out. Okay, thanks, bye.